Alrighty, welcome back. It's not often we will have a video on one character, but this is a pretty important character in the history of science, let alone the history of psychology. So today it is Darwin, or at least for this video it's Darwin. So we're going to focus on Darwin. No, I'm not going to go through all the details. I know that you guys get Darwin in virtually every course you're in, or at least every science course. So I know now by a third year course you have a really good sense of Darwin and his impact. So I'm going to focus more on what his work meant in a psychological context. But I'm also going to start a little bit with this history of psychology stuff. I want to use Darwin to echo some of the themes that we talked about in the very first module. Okay, so it's kind of weird. Okay, there we go. These two themes specifically. Remember when we were talking about history of psychology and telling the history, and that very often you emphasize people like Darwin, and you can give the impression that we wouldn't be where we are now if it wasn't for Darwin. However, I think Darwin himself is a very interesting example of that notion of zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. Remember that. I like this quote from Victor Hugo: "There is nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come." There is this claim, this notion that some ideas are just bound to happen within a certain context. And during this time of Darwin, the sort of mid-1800s, early to mid-1800s, in a sense, evolution theory was already out there. Nobody had sort of nailed it down the way Darwin has, or had talked about it, but especially in work like geography, where they're talking about rock formations, they had a lot of this notion of interactions of the world and how they've changed as environments change. So we've talked about how certain rock structures grow to reflect their environment, or the environment of the time. So you could learn about previous environments by looking at rock structures. And, a lot of those ideas were kind of out there. And what Darwin kind of did was connect the animal world to some of that, and to say, the features of animals might also be connected to the environment. You've read now, and you probably already knew about, the fact that Wallace had very similar ideas as Darwin, apparently independently generated, and that's what kind of pushed Darwin to get his ideas out there, because he was kind of sitting on them for too long. That also tells you that it was just, the time was just right for that sort of idea to be born and to be embraced and accepted. And so Darwin is ultimately the person we attribute evolution theory to, but it could have easily have been somebody else, perhaps. So you kind of see that when you read about Darwin, and it makes that distinction clear. So I like to emphasize that. Also, screamingly, Darwin is a great example of the notion of a paradigm shift. So this is actually an abstract from a paper that focuses on this question of Darwin's effect on the paradigm shift. And here they focus on the paradigm shift from creation to evolution. So really, and this is why some of Darwin's work was so controversial in the beginning when he published it in a very religious Christian kind of context. But until Darwin, the notion was that God created everything in the form it currently is. And Darwin said, no, maybe not. Maybe things change their form. Maybe the whole variability of life we see is the result of a process, not the result of a creator. And so, wow, what a big change, right? What a sort of mind-blowing thing for people, right? And so when we talk about paradigm shifts, Copernican revolution, the second Copernican revolution, Darwin really kind of messed with everybody's heads by saying there's another way to think about all of this. So he argued that humans are part of nature, not above it. Everything we talked about before, right? The sort of scalia naturae, the idea of humans occupying that top rung. Darwin says, no, we're just another life form. We behave, and our evolution follows the same rules as the evolution of every other animal. So just like Copernicus kind of knocked us one when we said, well, your planet's not the center of the universe. Darwin kind of said, yeah, and you know what, our species ain't the center of the planet either. It's just another species, just like our planet is just another planet. So, humans really began by thinking we were so special, and then we have all of these thinkers kind of saying, no, maybe not. So big time paradigm shift. Now, he caused this paradigm shift, in terms of us thinking about how the variety of life came to exist. But he also impacted a number of other paradigm shifts along the way. One of the things that this is really kind of looking ahead to where we're going, but I want to foreshadow this for when you get there because I'll bring it back up. This distinction we're going to see between structuralism and functionalism. You will learn that the very first psychologists were what we would call structuralists. They're going to be concerned with trying to understand what mind kind of looks like. What's it like in there? So almost like physics, they're going to try to describe the structure of consciousness, of conscious existence. But at some point, that gets pushed over and functionalism starts to take control, where we don't really care about what conscious experience looks like or feels like. We care about what it's doing. What is the purpose? This is a very powerful reflection of Darwin as well, because if you even think of him in a biological context, before Darwin, and in fact, this is what Darwin started out doing, the paradigm of biology was to collect specimens and then to try to organize them into categories, into groups. And so things now like reptiles and amphibians and stuff. So people looked at all these and they said, okay, this is a reptile and this is a mammal. And so they would spend a lot of time. And when, Darwin was originally out on the voyage of the Beagle, that's what he was doing. He was collecting all these rare specimens from South America, a very strange part of the world for the British, and trying to figure out how these new critters fit in this organization scheme. And so if we think about it there, people were looking at what the critters looked like to figure out which category they belonged to. But at some point, Darwin said the following: these things look the way they do for a reason. And that reason is, when the critters look this way, there's a benefit for them. There's something good about having a beak like that one has. And it's not just good in general, it's good in context. And what I mean by that is that beak works really well for that animal in the world in which it lives. Another version of that animal who lives in a different world may have evolved a different kind of beak that works well for it. So just to be a little more concrete, he focused on finches, and so he noticed that some finches had long pointy beaks, which was good for them because they ate a lot of insects and trees, so that allowed them to get at the insects. Whereas other finches had short, powerful beaks, and that allowed them to crack nuts, which was good because there were a lot of nuts where they lived. And so it seemed like whatever food was plentiful, the characteristics of the animal reflected their food source. And that was the beginning of his evolution theory. But in this case, it's like it looks that way for a reason. Don't get hung up on what it looks like. Get hung up on what it does. What's the function of that? And so his ideas did sneak into psychology, as you'll see. And let me, by the way, back up 1809 to 1882. You're going to see this is around when psychology is starting. Okay, as you will see. And so his ideas were percolating through the academic community, the intellectual community, and they eventually pushed people away from structuralism towards functionalism. So the effect that he had in biology to make people start to ask, why does the animal have that kind of feature, also had an impact in psychology. And we started asking, why do those thoughts occur the way they do? What are those things doing? I'm going to come back to this point, but I just want to foreshadow that. Okay. A couple of other things to say about Darwin just in the psychological context. First of all, there's a whole class now of psychological theory that is sometimes connected to evolution. And so there may be something like consciousness where we can say, humans seem to be aware of their own thoughts. Why? What's the purpose of this? What's the use? And I'll give you one example of this. One thing that I've thrown out there about consciousness is that what it allows an animal to do is replay a learning experience in their mind. And so I say things like, imagine a deer brought its one of its children to a watering hole and was attacked by a predator that lived somewhere nearby. And it got away, but its child did not. So if that was all that happened, then we would have one learning experience for that deer, right? It went to the water, it chose a given behavior, a certain result came of it, it lost its child, and that might make it hesitant to go back to that water. But it was only one experience, right? But what if that deer replayed that experience in its mind over and over and kept sort of recalling losing its child in that way? Suddenly that one learning experience can become multiple. It can be multiplied in consciousness. And that can produce a stronger learning effect. So I don't know. I just made up that story. I didn't just make it up. It's based on some ideas, but it is an evolutionary story how an animal that possessed consciousness might now learn quicker than other animals, and therefore be able to survive and reproduce at a higher rate. So sometimes in psychology, we use evolution theory to actually try to describe why certain abilities came to be, and you'll see that all through. Be careful with evolution theories. Evolution is pretty powerful, and if you're a clever person, you can tell an evolutionary story about almost everything. So you got to be a little careful, but you will see evolution-based theories all through psychology. All right. So there's that general thing. But specifically, there's two branches of psychology that didn't exist before Darwin. Nothing really existed before Darwin, but they really came to exist by building on Darwin's ideas. So the first one of these is individual differences. A lot of psychology is concerned about the average human being. How does memory work on average? How does attention work on average? How does perception work on average? But there are now some areas that are interested in why certain individuals are different than others. So things like intelligence, personality, creativity. Why are some people more creative than others? Can we make people more creative? Is there a possibility? But these parts of psychology are not interested in the average human. They're interested in the variety of humans and trying to explain that variety, which of course sounds very Darwin, who is interested in the variety of life, right? And so they've taken a lot of cues from Darwinian theory in the individual differences research that we see in a lot of these areas. Also, of course, comparative psychology. The attempt to understand ourselves by better comparing us to other species. So Darwin essentially said, we are part of the same animal kingdom. We are all one. And therefore, we are all sort of biological machines. And therefore, we can learn about ourselves maybe by comparing and contrasting us with other animals, other variants of biological machines. That came to be called comparative psychology. Sometimes it really produces startling results. I'm going to show you one right now, and I'm just going to shut up and play it. But watch this. It's kind of freaky, and then I'll come in at the end. All right, so let's do it.
The scientists at Japan's Primate Research Institute, the PRI, where Ayumu is based, have devised intelligence tests for chimps. One test is for what's called working memory, the brain's ability to temporarily store and use information. The numbers 1 to 9 are randomly scattered across a touchscreen. The chimp looks at them for as long as is needed to memorize the layout. Then, as soon as 1 is touched, the other numbers are hidden and must now be remembered. We volunteered Chris, the director of this program, to demonstrate this test. He's a college graduate and a crossword addict, but how good is his working memory? When Chris reckons he has memorized the layout, he touches 1. When the others are hidden, he must try to recall 2 to 9 in ascending order.
It takes me ages to remember where they're all placed, and then I think I've got it. It's really very, very difficult.
In 30 attempts, Chris only once reached 9 without making a mistake.
As soon as they're blanked over, it's like my mind's been blanked over as well.
When Ayumu sat the same test, he correctly remembered the numbers almost 90% of the time.
Ayumu gets it right almost every time, and I've got it right once.
Chris fears he's let his species down. But even when the PRI played Ayumu against their best human students who were given regular practice sessions, Ayumu still beat all humans. Other chimps at the PRI have also sat the exams. Among these apes, computer skills are as normal as the ability to swing from the trees. Though none of his rivals beat Ayumu, a few came close, and average chimp results turned out to be higher than amongst humans. So, does that efficient working memory mean chimps are cleverer than humans? We tracked down a scientist who studies chimps in the wild, Dr. Nick Newton-Fisher.
I think it's interesting the results that suggest that chimps may have particular cognitive abilities that are different and maybe in some aspects better than humans, because chimpanzees are not small, primitive, furry humans. They are a species that we share a common ancestor with maybe 5-6 million years ago, but they've evolved along their own individual path. They're better at doing chimp things and we're better at doing human things. And some chimp things may not simply be climbing up and down trees and eating figs. Some of those chimp things might be mental abilities as well.
That's chimps 1, humans 0.
Alrighty, there we go. So, I bring that up for a few reasons. First of all, Darwin, it's kind of interesting. Let's get some primates in there and get you all thinking about that. But on the comparative psychology side, that shows you how by comparing humans to another species, we can sometimes have some of our assumptions kind of mucked with, right? And including the Aristotelian notion of, we are the best at everything. And we quickly realize, even when it comes to like a cognitive, a reason, well, is it reason? Would you say working memory is reason? I don't know. But even, in psychological sort of testing context, sometimes some species can be better than we are. And, that just, I like it because it's humbling. It kind of puts us in our place a little bit. But it also gets us thinking a little bit more about how working memory works and what it might be there for and why a chimp might be better at it than we would be. So at any rate, that's a great example of comparative psychology, which is another area of research that Darwin, that really sprung from Darwin's ideas. Okay, so I believe that's my whole Darwin right now. Yep. And I just want to emphasize, and again, I'll try to do a better job here. This is the end of chapter 3. So the next lectures will be on chapter